It's an honor for me to moderate this discussion. I would like to ask first Christo Grozev to make his keynote. What is the stand of the play, the disinformation war right now, from his point of view, and then Ivan Krastev will have approximately the same time, and then we will open the discussion.
Thank you very much. I will try to present a couple of thoughts about the paradigm of disinformation in the war that I see now, which will be probably controversial, and I would like to use them just as a starting point for a conversation. I think the situation is not as bad as it could have been, as it would have been, if Russia had deployed all of its skills and history of operational excellence in disinformation with the full focus. And the reason why they haven't is because they didn't plan for this war to continue for as long, and they didn't plan for a lot of the other front lines that they have to engage with, also in information warfare domestically. So I think we're seeing a sort of a maintenance level campaign of disinformation and promoting disinformation by the Russian government at the moment. And we're also seeing a sort of a successful counter disinformation, but also at times very tactical misinformation, disinformation provided by the Ukrainian side in the war, which they have the full right to in the case of a defensive war position that they're forced to be in at the moment. What do I mean by we don't see the full potential of the Russian war machine? I mean, I've been monitoring some internal communication. I've been talking to people that are close to the disinformation machine in the Kremlin, and they are seeing a sort of a doomed scenario for themselves. They don't think that they can convince anybody who's not already pre-convinced of the righteousness of the Russian side in the war in changing their mind. So they're providing a maintenance degree of disinformation for, let's call them very generically, the useful idiots or the people who are already aligned with the Russian narrative in the rest of the world, insofar as the main topic of the war and what happens on the front line takes place. So to give you an example, a year ago, the Russian ambassador to the Netherlands made this sort of a obscene and almost self-immolating TV interview on Dutch television, where he tried to convince the Dutch public that two completely distinct women who were attacked and part of the maternity hospital attack in Mariupol were the same woman. And this was one of the examples of how Russian disinformation was ineffective, because it caused a very strong sort of a fallout, and the Dutch society was angry at an obvious lie, because these were two different women. One had been killed, the other one had been essentially kidnapped by Russia later. And I feel that a lot of Russian disinformation mellowed down for an international audience after that, because of the blowback of bad, inefficient attempts like this. What we are seeing now is, again, a level of maintenance, moderate disinformation, trying to come up with an alternative scenario for every event, notable event on the front line, mostly in order to obscure and make it more difficult for disinterested audiences in the West, in Europe, and in the United States to choose the sort of the narrative that they believe, mostly to make them tired, mostly to make them confused. And this is working in many cases. I mean, the dam explosion, in the example we're looking at today, is a good example, because the investment of mental powers in trying to take a position early on in such a case is overwhelming for the average reader and listener. And they're going to park it out for later, and later this topic will be displaced by another topic. So it will never become a clear-cut answer for a large part of the population. What they are focusing on is creating stronger disinformation narratives where people are more susceptible to that. I mean, the majority of the Western society is not susceptible to the concept of Russia waging a just war. So they're kind of giving up that narrative. They're not pushing that narrative. What they're trying to push, however, quite actively, is the narrative that it was the United States and NATO that pushed Russia into this war. It's not a just war for Russia, but neither is it without fault for the rest of the world. And this is working. This is working for a large part of the American audience, for a large part of the so-called skeptical users of media in Europe. And we see that over and over. So that is working. Another narrative that they're successfully pushing is the narrative of the Ukrainians causing trouble in Europe and wherever they end up being in large numbers. And that is also working, because these are narratives that are to which most of society is susceptible, because they don't know better and they can be influenced one way or another quite fast. On the other hand, what we do see is a lot of misinformation, not disinformation, being promoted by agents of influence in the misinformation sphere. And I would not hesitate to name somebody like Elon Musk as a very, very strong agent of misinformation. I don't think he wants to disinform. I think his mind works in a way where he likes to challenge publicly accepted concepts, and that is irresponsible in many ways, where he's putting under question mark a lot of credible and valid information. I mean, he took a direct hit at my organization, Bellingcat, by calling it a psychological operations organization. And when we try to trace down the source of such belief in his head, it is not some malign intent to damage Bellingcat. It's just that he had read a group of articles in a publication called The Gray Zone about Bellingcat. And we had found out earlier that a lot of the basic facts used in those articles have been created by artificial intelligence, by ChatGPT, in the form of fake references and fake footnotes to articles about Bellingcat. So you can see how misinformation can be just as influential, or even more influential in terms of the negative effect during a time of war than active disinformation. Now, this does not mean that we are in a great space, because it just means that the main impact of disinformation is delayed. What we see is that the disinformation machine in Russia, which includes such notable examples as the GRU Special Propaganda Unit, and obviously the privatized troll farms, they're focused currently on a domestic problem. They're focused on trying to prevent and preempt the disintegration of society, the consolidation of society around the war. And it's a finite resource. It's a limited resource that they can't stretch forever. This actually, we are being helped at the moment by the fact that Prigozhin, who was running one of the most efficient, if not the most effective disinformation machine in Russia internationally, is not really fully motivated to be helping the current goals of the Kremlin because of his own sort of standoff with the government and the Ministry of Defense. And we are benefiting from the fact that actually one of the professional players in disinformation is demotivated. And as I said, the special propaganda machine of the GRU are focused on domestic audiences at the moment. What is also helping this is the fact that Russian society is not as consolidated as it may appear to us in terms of the support for the war effort. And they have to allocate a lot more resources than previously thought. Russian society may not, in its large part, may not be open to Western narratives about what's happening on the front line, but it is equally skeptical to Kremlin narratives. And this, I've given examples at previous speeches. We've been following the most frequently asked questions on the Russian version of Google, on Yandex, over the more than a year of the war. And we see that in the top 10 of questions, it's always questions that doubt the official narratives. that are trying to find answers somewhere in the depth of the internet about things that they don't trust the government telling the truth about, starting from what happened to the Moskva cruiser, what happened really in Bucha, ending with why is Ukraine winning in the war early on. I mean, this was a question that was one of the top 5 questions on the Russian internet within about 3 to 4 months of the start of the war. So you can see the level of unconsolidation of public opinion in Russia, level of skepticism, and this explains why so much efforts have to be paid in that direction. Last, I would mention that in some recent conversations that we've kind of been privy to, I've been privy to, it seems that the Kremlin at the top has decided to park the efforts to convert Western opinion or a large part of Western opinion in favor of understanding the Russian narrative, quote unquote, we've lost the battle now. We will wait for the West to tire from the war, and then we'll start our propaganda machine after that. So we haven't apparently seen the start of the major Russian disinformation war, which is supposed to start when the West tires of supporting Ukraine. So this is just a few words from me to explain why I think we haven't seen as professional as disinformation war from Russia as we might have. But it doesn't mean that it's not working, because even at maintenance levels, a large swathes of society are already prepared to accept the Russian or at least an anti-Ukrainian narrative, and we see different percentages per country of such swaths of the population. We see that unfortunately Bulgaria is a country where a large percent of the population prefers to hear a pro-Russian narrative, and anything that counters that causes cognitive dissonance. And similarly, we see even neighboring countries that one would argue should be similar in their ability to process information that is tied to ideological precepts, such as the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We see a significantly higher proclivity of Slovakian audiences to accept pro-Russian narratives than in the Czech Republic. So yes, it is working to a different degree in different countries, but my point is it hasn't been perfected. It hasn't been perfect, and I feel that we are more a threat from misinformation agents than from disinformation agents. I'd be very interested to hear what the other speaker thinks on this topic, and I'll stop now at this.
Thank you, Christo. Ivan Krastev, there was even a direct question: what do you think about the state of disinformation right now? And if I've understood correctly, Christo, the major disinformation operation of Russia will start actually when Kremlin feels that Europe is overwhelmed by war fatigue. Can we say that we see something like this right now?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I'm really sorry that being not in the room, being on the screen is not the most convincing thing that you can do. Secondly, Christo is the person who has a much more experience than me, basically not simply speaking on the conferences, but seeing how basically disinformation flows works. As a result of it, I'll try to be very brief and make 3 basic points. And the first is, we are living in a world in which mistrust is the default option. So nevertheless, of what kind of a source, particularly of official information you're getting, and this is true for all societies, but this is also true to Russia, the problem is why they're telling me this. And I do believe that one of kind of a strengths of the Russian propaganda, particularly before the war, because I very much agree with Christo, I do believe that is very much based on weaponizing mistrust. And from this point of view, this is critically important, because the major story of the Russian propaganda is not so much to sell us their narrative, but basically to erode the narrative that is coming from our governments and also from the mainstream media. If the Soviet Union believed that they're better than the West, and this was at the heart of their propaganda, now the major argument is we're not different. And I'm saying this because for me, one of the critical things to understand how it works was to try to explain certain things that does not make much sense. And one was when in 2014, the Russian special forces basically landed in Crimea. President Putin personally went into television and said that there is no Russian special forces in Crimea. Listen, politicians are lying, even heads of state, but normally you're lying on certain things on which you have certain room to maneuver, and basically said that it was not true. But the moment when he was saying that there were no Russian special forces in Crimea, probably his Western colleagues knew the names of the people. And he himself, 2 weeks later, gave them medals for being there. So why then you're lying? And you're lying to be called a liar. So then you can say, liar like you. What about the weapons for mass destruction in Iraq? I do believe that this type of a game in which you all the time is doing something that is excessive, try to be exposed, and after that you weaponize it, the famous kind of a judo metaphor with which the Russian president was so much happy to work was very important for this initial period. Secondly, in the information war, disinformation can be as important as the true information. Strangely enough, quite often you can basically be disbalanced also on the basis of a very much of a true information. One of the major decisions that the American government has done was that prior to the war, they decided to do something that normally intelligence agencies never do, which means basically publish on a daily basis the type of information about the movement of the Russian forces that they had. And the major argument was that President Putin, as somebody coming from the intelligence services till now, had never started a war in the absence of surprise. So you believe that if you're going to show him how much you know about the movement, about the communication within the Russian staff, and by the way, Bellingcat did a great story, basically shows how it works. It's not simply basically what is true and what is not true, how it works. But unfortunately, this didn't work, and basically the war started. I'm saying this, and then I go to my third point. We should not go into the trap of explaining everything that you don't like with the Russian disinformation, and particularly the fake news and others. And I'm saying this because we're always focusing on the supply side, but there is a demand side. Many of the people who are consuming, for example, Russian narrative, consume it not because the Russians are giving it to them, but because they want to consume it. And this is particularly true when they're trying not to say that the Russians were right. And Christo was absolutely right on this. Even the Russians cannot tell the story as a kind of a great patriotic war. The major story is, it's not black and white. So the major idea of disinformation is about creating a gray zone in which everybody is equal, no argument is better than other argument, and everything is not as it looks like. So the major message is, do not trust your eyes. And from this point of view, I was reminded at the end of the World War I, during the Versailles Treaty, one of the members of the German delegation went to the French leader Clemenceau and said, Mr. Clemenceau, probably in 100 years, historians are going to have a different view of what all this war was about. And then Clemenceau said, for sure, but nobody was going to claim that Belgium attacked Germany. So from this point of view, I do believe that the Russian propaganda believes that in the world in which we're living, even probably in 10 years, somebody can claim that Ukraine attacked Russia. And this is it. And as a result of it, try to understand that many of the views and many of the information which we consumed is based on our value or ideological predispositions, that we're very much there. We consume the information in the way we want to consume. In the way you go to a restaurant and you're not talking basically a schnitzel simply by accident, and you're doing it because you're not vegetarian, for example. This is a lot with the information basically we're consuming. And from this point of view, it's quite important. The strength of the disinformation comes that it creates communities. It creates communities of argument. It can mainstream certain arguments. It can make certain things which are not true to start to look legitimate. And I'm saying this because when we're just focusing also on the Russian sources of disinformation, we're totally underestimating the fact that for very special reasons, people and groups in our own societies are telling stories which are very much kind of drastically changing what is happening on the ground, not because they're necessarily interested to serve the Russians, because they want to serve themselves. For example, they want to delegitimize certain governments, certain positions, certain media, and this is the story. And probably Irina know better than me, but this is also the biggest problem of the journalists. Because in a certain way, you don't know what to say. For example, all this kind of investigative stuff, we're coming to a certain truth, and you know that it could be weaponized, and it can be weaponized in a way that you cannot imagine. So for me, this creates also a lot of moral problems on the side of the journalists, and particularly journalists who on one side want to tell the truth, but on the other know that they're functioning in an environment where a lot of their leaders believe that there is no truth, and everything is just an information war. I want to end up here because, as I told you, I never was one of the people who believed that simply through disinformation, particularly centralized disinformation acts by a certain type of players, we can explain everything. And where I do believe Christo is absolutely right, the biggest now target of the Russian propaganda is Russian society. And interestingly enough, in order to make it effective, they were even forced to give much more pluralism in certain positions, because this kind of a vertical propaganda that we had before is not going to be effective anymore. This is why you should have different opinions. You should have some people being outraged by certain things, even that the governments are doing, because otherwise they had the feeling that people are living in a kind of information coma, and they don't know how this is going to end up.
My question is, does it matter? And actually, to what extent of disinformation fatigue it contributes, and should we not allow the disinformation war against the meaning of everything to be normalized? Because this we saw here in Bulgaria, the Istanbul Convention, the disinformation against it, the creation of non-existing creatures, non-existing reality that became part of the political reality even. Should we, how to say, just used to this and just say, okay, that's what is the what the Russians do, and now they're focusing internally. They need to convince their own society, so it's not anymore the problem in front of the West, for the West.
No, listen, it is a problem, but declaring something a problem does not mean that you can solve the problem. You have an open information space. And this is one of the things basically that work there. In this open information space is that everybody tries to influence it. And this is going to become much more brutal, by the way, with the technologicals going up. Because, for example, if you're Bulgarian or Hungarian, you're very much protected by the fact that you have a small language, which is not the case, for example, in the English-speaking world. But now you have a translation programs, which is going to allow somebody who has never been seeing Bulgaria anymore to be able basically to send messages and to go and talk to you on a language in which you're never going to know, do you talking to a bot or do you talking to a person? And here is the biggest problem for any type of liberal individual. When, for example, you go into social media and you start discussing about the war with somebody, normally you're trying to reach a kind of constructive compromise in order to convince the other side. You're trying to change also your position in order to reach kind of a common ground. Imagine that it is not a person, but you're talking basically to a bot. And the bot is the classical idea, the fanatic. The bot never changed their minds. And this creates this type of a pressure, and this creates this panic in which suddenly we're changing our position. We're ready to accept this and that, and the other side is not accepting anything. And I do believe this is a new information situation. This is not going to be changed simply by saying we can easily basically restrain some type of a government-centered sources of Russian information, which already happened in the European Union. And by the way, Russia has done this to the Western media a decade before the war started. The biggest problem is that operating in a world in which mistrust is the default option is very different from operating in a world in which people generally start with trust and after they're asking questions. And my last point on this is we're very much centered on the war. The real moment in which this was transformed was during the pandemic. Listen, there is a major difference between the war and the pandemic from the point of view of countries which are not in the direct military actions. Pandemic goes closer to everybody else. You should decide for yourselves to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. Do you going to trust the government on this or not trust it on that? And then you come up with a kind of constituencies which after that can be politically mobilized. It's not by accident that many of the kind of anti-vaxxer communities and others have been politically after that mobilized for different reasons, because they basically made their mistrust part of their signature understanding of their relations to the governments. And to be honest, there are many things on which the government should be mistrusted. This is the story. You cannot go and say trust the government, because in many cases our governments are also quite economical with the truth. And secondly, the truth is not easy to be figured out. Listen, we don't know what happened in Kakhovka at this level. It's going to take some time. It could be, by the way, an accident. It does not need to be the operation of none of the sides. But it is going to take a week before you can say something that really makes sense. But we are pushed to be positioned 2 hours after basically this is happening, and then the positioning goes immediately around kind of a ideological line. So this is a war. This is basically what you're doing. And I do believe this is changing a lot, and to be honest, a lot, particularly for the journalists. But as I said, Christo really knows much more than me about all this.
I fully agree with what Ivan said. I would just add to that while generally every society has a sort of suspicion to its government, which is traditionally economically true, this varies from one country to another. And generally, I believe it's obvious that societies that came from recently totalitarian and consistently deceiving government systems are much more conditioned to distrust their government. And this is helping us at the moment, because in Russia, the sort of the precept for societies to distrust its government much more. And here, what Putin did, and the example that Ivan gave in 2014, sort of the blatant lying, like, I know you know that I'm lying, but I will lie anyway. This is coming back to bite him, because this is the result. This is causing why so many people, even of the people who are patriotic on the Russian side of the war, are doubting the Russian version of events. It's kind of like, why is the government telling us this? Most likely they're telling us the opposite. The interesting anecdote here is that early on in the war, I think it was end of March last year, I got information that the FSB regional headquarters throughout the country had received a message from Lubyanka 1, from the headquarters of the FSB, and the message was sort of a fax machine message, which was like, if you hear any news about President Putin being seriously ill, do not believe it, and make sure that nobody believes it in your environment. And all of these FSB officers in the regions, they immediately took that to mean, oh, Putin is very sick. It's because of the default expectation that government is lying, which apparently works even at informed levels, like at the FSB. So imagine how it works on the average Russian. And again, you have that percentage of generic preconditioned distrust of the government in every society. Just happens to be more in Russia. And in countries like Bulgaria and Slovakia and so on and so forth, this is one of the reasons for a higher distrust in the mainstream narrative, which is also aligned with the government narrative of what's happening on the front line. And this is helping Russia in this particular case. I would like to only touch upon another topic that Ivan brought up, which is, essentially it's the same topic, but how is this reflected in the West? And is there anything we can do? Or should we just give it up and not do anything? First of all, I do think that it's not like we're not doing anything. I mean, at the beginning of the war, before it started, there was a lot of efforts by civic society and by media, such as Bellingcat and others, to debunk in real time some of the attempts by the Russian government to create a casus belli. Because starting a war with a casus belli that is credible or believable by a large part of even the predisposed society in the rest of the world was going to make support for Ukraine much harder. in the early stages of the war. And there were many attempts by Russia to create a casus belli, such as false flag attacks on facilities in Donetsk and so on and so forth. And media and civic organizations were quick to debunk that in real time. So that was a good investment of debunking in real time of every false fact that was being presented. Now, once the war started, it would be a lost cause, and it would be a very inefficient use of time of media and civic organizations to debunk every single statement of the maintenance campaign of disinformation, as I called it earlier. You don't need to do it, because you will then be bogged down in trying to mostly speak to an audience that doesn't believe you, or speak to an audience that already knows that this is not true. So what is a maintenance counter disinformation program? I think it is kind of reminding to the audience that is on your side that they should not fall into the rabbit hole of their own skepticism and their own distrust, because a large part of the population, for good reasons, is skeptical, not only of government, of their own perception of reality. So what you don't want to allow is a long stretch of time when agents of authority, such as Elon Musk, or journalists such as Sam or Hirsch, who spread narratives that challenge the mainstream media coverage of what's happening on the front line, to become the dominant, unchallenged narrative. And an example right now is the coverage of what happened on Nord Stream. Seymour Hersh published a completely fabricated story, in my view, and based on my analysis a couple of months ago, essentially saying that it was an American CIA operation that blew up Nord Stream. And this was heavily amplified by a lot of agents of authority in the West who actually trust him, and they don't trust the government, they don't trust the CIA. But the same people are now amplifying the opposite, or almost incompatible narrative, which came out in the last couple of days, which is, and it's most likely true, which is that the Americans had nothing to do with this. Actually, the Americans tried to prevent Ukraine from blowing up Nord Stream, and the CIA tried to prevent it from happening. But the same agents of authority are promoting now this narrative, and what debunkers can do is to point to the inconsistency, to the mutual exclusivity of these two narratives, because this would give a comfort to a lot of the skeptical audiences, the sort of critical thinkers, that everything is still the way we thought it was, right? So I think there is a point in measured debunking of large disinformation narratives.
Do you think that it is time for the West to engage in more complicated or smarter disinformation campaigns targeted on Russian citizens, at least to be in the same shoes like Russian minds, to understand what is the feeling when you are actually bombed each night, for instance, with real Russian missiles, or what does it mean to be targeted by counter disinformation? Do you think that it's a good time for counter disinformation operations?
I will give a quick answer to that. I think for the West, it's difficult to not engage in the hot war, but to engage in an information warfare. Because when you engage in information warfare, you're also making use of tools that are only allowed to a warring party, such as disinformation and propaganda. But Ukraine is at a hot war, and Ukraine is fully legitimately entitled to carry on an information warfare on the enemy, because they were attacked, both hot and with information. And they are doing a very good job in doing exactly what you're suggesting. They're doing a great job in reaching out to Russians in many different ways, including false flag information channels, and trying to convey to the Russian audience the cost of war. And I've seen some examples. We've seen some examples of, for example, false flag phone calls that I found particularly creative, mass phone calls to Russians living in the border areas, Rostov and Belgorod and so on and so forth, which pretend to be from the local police. And people are warned to keep their kids off the streets in the evening because there are so many returning former criminals from the Wagner private army that, as we all know, were recruited, many of them were recruited from prisons, that the criminogenic sort of percentage of expected crime is increasing. And this is a very subtle way to increase the awareness of the cost of the war to the Russian population. But it's not something that the West would feel comfortable playing. This game of counter disinformation or counter disinformation with disinformation methods. But for Ukraine, it's a completely legitimate game. And I think they're doing it quite successfully.
Ivan, what do you think about what is happening in Belgorod, the Belgorod rebels? Is this part of a Ukrainian covert operation, or it is something else?
To be absolutely honest about this, I don't know what to think because I have never been interested in this particular case. But there's some opinion polling data which came from Carnegie Russia, which shows that in fact support for the war is higher in the frontier regions than in the country as a whole. Listen, the biggest problem talking about the grand narratives is that there is one important success that the Russian propaganda had, and this was within Russia, and this didn't start on the day of the war. And basically, this is the idea that Russia is in a war with the United States and the West. This is mainstreamed, and of course, there is a part of the Russian population that never bought this, but even many people who are against the war had the feeling that this is not just the war between Russia and Ukraine. So secondly, do I believe that basically the West can go directly to the Russian citizens in the way it went during the Cold War with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty? I'm slightly skeptical at this moment. I do believe we have a much more difficult problem, and this is how to help the Russian media, which is outside of Russia, to try to talk in the way that is going to be effective to their own citizens. Because don't forget, many of the people who are very unhappy and very mistrustful to the Russian governments, they're not asking Putin the question, why did you start the war? They're asking, why are you not winning? And one of the major stories was that President Putin told us the truth when he said in the beginning that this is a special operation. The problem is that what was special operation ended and the war started. And in a certain way for him, what's important is to communicate this to his own people, and this is the war in which Russia is not well positioned to win. Let's put it like this. So from this point of view, here is the real issue. And the real issue is that many of these media, I have in mind Medusa or Rain, this is a major Russian opposition media, they're functioning from the territory of the European Union. And because they're functioning from the territory of the European Union, one of the major problems that they faced is how to cover the war, which is anti-war and anti-Putin, but at the same time effective to the Russians. And the most simple story is how you're calling the Russian troops. Are you calling them Russian troops or are you calling them our troops? Listen, the most important about the Russian army is that for many Russians who oppose the war, if their sons are going to be mobilized, they're going to be mobilized and they're going to be pushed to fight in the Russian army. And this is very difficult, particularly when some of these media have been in the Baltic states, where for very legitimate historical reasons, sensitivity of the population is very high. And people basically have the fear that anything that basically the Russians showing understanding of where the average Russian stands is morally unacceptable. But paradoxically, this is the most important part of the group. You never get the information simply on the basis of the information itself. It's very much who is talking to you. And by the way, the best example is Ukraine itself. President Zelensky has a support of 25% when the war started. It was his ready to stay. It was his readiness to risk his life. It was the famous sentence, I don't want a run, I want an ammunition, that made Ukrainians trust him. So from this point of view, the trust is not simply based on the quality of information. Believe me that even if you're going to get you are for political reasons suspicious for, you're not going to take it. And I do believe for us, this is the most important, is how to help some of these Russians outside of Russia. And by the way, it's not easy for them, because even for 1 year being outside of the country, the words are changing. The sensibility is changing. Many of the Russians who oppose the war, and there is a lot of Russians who are not happy with what is happening, they don't want to talk about this. Funnily enough, and this is why when you're asking me what I think about Belgorod and others, I agree first with Christo. It's a war. From this point of view, the Ukrainians has the right to use anything that you're using in a war. You cannot basically say the Russians can do this and the Ukrainians cannot do this. This is not how you're fighting a war if you want to win. On the other side, there is something that in my view is very important. It is very important not to allow the Russian government and media to convince the Russians that basically they're defending themselves, and if the war is going to end up, the only thing that everybody is talking about is disintegration of Russia, devastation, and so on, because this is a society which is traumatized by the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And this is going to give certain type of resource to Putin, which otherwise he does not have. For us, it's very important to tell them that this is not a great patriotic war. This is the Afghan operation. And what is going to happen is exactly what happened in Afghanistan. By the way, and this is my last point, there was in 2019, 30 years after 1989, Levada was asked a question, what is the most important thing that happened in 1989? And they're giving to the Russians different options. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it was Polish elections and so on. 58% of the Russians declared that the most important thing that happened was the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And in my view, trying to understand this is what you're facing now. A colonial war that is going to fail because the Ukrainians are not going to live with this, because this was the war that tried to convince the world that they're not Ukrainians. And on this, I very much agree with Mr. Prigozhin, that basically now, because of this war, everybody knows where is Ukraine and who are the Ukrainians. So as a result of it, but this is not simply a disinformation. This is about deciding how to reach and talk people who are never going to see the world in the way you're seeing if you're bombed in Kiev. This, keep in mind, it's very difficult to believe that average Ronish is going basically to be able, if he's not particularly morally sensitive, to empathize in the way of the do. But it's not easy choices. And by the way, this is the choices of European governments. And this is why how link with the Russian media is an important question.
Okay, let me give the floor to the audience.
Hello, Nerijus Maliukevičius, Vilnius University, Lithuania. First of all, I would like to thank both of you for what you are doing in countering disinformation. And a short question very specifically for Christo Grozev. You mentioned that GRU unit is now concentrated internally. Was it just a general comment, or can you elaborate a bit more what you meant by that?
Yes, it was quite specific. There is this PSYOPS operation that we've all studied, and Mr. Starunsky is the chief of this operation. And essentially, we've seen communication, we've intercepted communication where they're complaining that they cannot proceed with international operations to the same degree as they were planning to, because they have to allocate resources to domestic prevention of what they call trevozhные signaly, signals of concern. And this has to do with a new initiative that our colleagues, our friends from called the Cyber Partisans of Belarus have published some information in the last couple of days that I invite you to look at. It's a project called VEPR, and it's a sort of a Kremlin-mandated project to prevent dissent, prevent centrifugal forces, prevent anti-war sentiment in Russia, to which all of the security services have to allocate their information forces to participate. And that is the reason, that is what sucks out a lot of the energy and efforts from people like Starunsky and the FSB equivalent of his unit.
Raul Rebane, Tallinn, Estonia. I asked this question today in the morning from the experts and ask you too. What will be the biggest dream or narrative or myth, what remains in Russian people's soul after the war is ended? Is it empire still? Is it, I don't know, great power? Is it state? What it is? What do you think?
Let me try. And by the way, this is a much more interesting and difficult question to be answered in 3 minutes. But there is one important thing to happen is basically one of the paradoxes of the disintegration of the Soviet Union was that during the Soviet period, Russians as an ethnic group has been trading power for identity. In a certain way, basically, if you remember, there was not a communist party of the Russian Federation, and there was not a government of the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union. At the same time, there was a second Russian, ethnic Russians, which have been basically a key figure in the governments of most of the national republics. Why I'm saying this, national identity was much stronger on the periphery and much weaker at the center of Russia. As a result of it, Russian nationalism of this type is a latecomer. This is not by accident that if you're carefully reading people like Prigozhin, he's envying the Ukrainians. They want to have this type of a nationalism. They want to have a leader like Zelensky. They want to have this because all the Russian imperial project was based on a very weak and inclusive Russian identity. In a certain way, everybody who basically wants to be Russian, speaks the language, shares the culture, could be treated like Russian. In the moment when the empire started to disintegrate, this does not work well for Russia. And President Putin, and this is a long conversation which everybody has his obsession and I have mine, I do believe that President Putin was very, very much also shaped by his very profound demographic fears of what is happening to the Russian population. If you see the 3 months before the war, on several different occasions, without being asked, he was quoting a prediction by the famous Russian 19th century scientist Mendeleev that in the year 2000, there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And now he said there are only 150 million because of the wars, because of revolutions, and so on and so on. So this fear that there are not enough Russians in the world changed a kind of this classical imperial project, which was very much based on a multi-ethnic type of an empire, to an idea for creating Russian ethnic states in which Belarusians and Ukrainians should be converted into Russians. In a certain way, paradoxically, we see a form of genocidal inclusion. Russians are fighting Ukrainians because Ukrainians are not ready to understand that they're Russians. And as a result of it, basically, what you're going to end up, and by the way, something similar, of course, in a totally different key has happened in Turkey at the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, where basically the Turkish identity was very weak. And basically, we have Atatürk, which created the Turkish ethnic states based on the kind of a much more ethnic idea of a nation which was not so much present before. As a result of it, depending how the war is going to end, you're going to have a different kind of a question concerning about what is all this Russian identity. But I'm saying this because this is the question, and this is what very many people cannot understand. Paradoxically, part of this aggression that comes on the side of the Russian government is rooted in the fact that Russian identity is the weakest identity on the territory of the former Soviet Union. I'm even not talking about the Baltic republics or the Georgians or Armenians, but basically Ukrainians. And to be honest, Belarusians these days can much easier define what it means to be, who are we. And this also explains, in my view, part of the things that otherwise very few people are going to understand, the massive abduction of kids. In the Russian ideology of basically they all are Russians, they are our kids, and we're not going to allow our kids to be turned into Ukrainians.
Do you think that EU and NATO are doing enough for supporting Ukraine?
This is one of the questions that should be forbidden. What it means enough. Okay. By the way, are they doing enough or not? You're going to know when the war is over. And secondly, of course, when people are dying. So from this point of view, are they doing something serious? Yes. Is it easier for them to do more? Is also not easy question, because when you're helping, it's also very important to keep the population on your side. And for the moment, European Union succeeds in this much better than many people expected on the day the war started. Before leaving, I'm just going to give you two figures. 65 billion is the money that European Union and the member states has contributed to the Ukrainian effort, both in military and civilian support. 700 billion is the money that European Union and the European members states have spent on compensating their own societies for the economic impact of the war. So when you're trying to see basically the war costs, keep in mind that this is also one of the important things. Some of the spendings are on the level of COVID. And this is why this war is not a war in Europe. It is a war on Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm
More
leaving
questions? Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for your time. Well, I'm again opening the floor. We still have Christo, Grozev. Please go ahead with questions.
Hello, I'm Martin Luhan from Czech Republic. What inspired me in your talk, among other things, of course, was that you and Bellingcat responded immediately after the war, fighting for the narrative of the casus belli, of the Russian invasion. And I was thinking, so I started to create some kind of a table or chart of, or harmonogram of how fast should the actors of this, or the actors in the media sphere react when something like that happens. Who should be first? Who should react, in hours? Who should react in days? Probably the regulators or politicians, they have days or weeks. The European Union or the international politicians, they have even more time for reactions. But so the laws that we are discussing in the morning, they take years or months to adopt. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on that? So how fast should the actors react? Because the title of this conference is involvement of CSOs, right? So civic society organizations. So do we have a recommendation for the civic society organizations, how fast they should react, and where in this sequence of reactions they should find themselves?
It's a very legitimate structural question. So far, I don't think there's any rules other than common sense and personal responsibility in being able to use one's authority in a particular sphere to debunk in real time and to provide the ammunition for others to cover a particular story with a particular knowledge base and particular expertise. I think it is, we have investigating journalists, we have investigating platforms such as Bellingcat, but also such as the conflict intelligence team in Russia, who are positioned to come up within hours or definitely within a day with some early assessment that may be as neutral as we don't know what happened with the dam, so do not jump to conclusions. And I think it's the responsibility of such entities to, even if there's no finality to their judgment, to come up with some early assessment, because otherwise general media, mainstream media, who do not have the resources to conduct such spot investigations, will have to make a much harder choice to take a narrative of one side or to cover both narratives as if they're equally substantiated, which are the examples that Irena told us about earlier. So I think it is still the obligation of fact checkers with some knowledge of the particular topic to come up with an early assessment and then to update it at some point later on. But I think the role of public institutions and governments is very important even here, because I'll give you an example. I mean, we at Bellingcat publish investigations about potential war crimes, about potential disinformation, and we believe that we've cracked the case and we publish it. But if there's no follow-up from law enforcement or from governments in the face of blatant displayed facts of either war crimes or disinformation, then this diminishes the credibility of our reporting or of anyone's reporting. And thus, I'm happy that some of the crucial investigations we've made, for example, we made an investigation into something that was presented by the Russians as a Ukrainian group of a Ukrainian false flag operation mutilating a Russian soldier who, according to the Russian narrative, had been dressed up in Ukrainian clothes so that it looks like Russian soldiers are mutilating a Ukrainian soldier. We published very quickly, within 2 days of this claim by the Russian side, a thorough investigation into what really happened, and that it was in fact a Russian battalion that had mutilated a Ukrainian soldier. And within a month of that publication, there were sanctions imposed on the people that we identified as the culprits in this case by both the European Union and the United States. And something like that comes to validate reporting and to make it much more meaningful the next time we do it. Obviously, it also puts a heavy burden on fact checkers and reporters that you cannot make even one mistake, because your disclosures are consequential, and they could have sanctions as a consequence. So I think it is an interplay of civic institutions, of journalists, of particular type of journalists. You start with qualified fact checkers, people that have experience in war investigations, then mainstream media who cover that story, and then governments who have to follow up on that, because otherwise the story becomes hard to believe.
Yeah, I agree that it is extremely important also from pure journalistic point of view, the follow-up by the institutions. Otherwise, actually, we do not have effective media. And we know very well in Bulgaria what does it feel like. But Christo, I want to ask you, do you still trust the data more than human sources? Because this is what distinguishes Bellingcat and your particular work there from the traditional type of journalism.
Yeah, I haven't been failed by data so far. Data is reliable if you know how to treat it, treat it as in the traditional sense of journalism, by looking for 2 or 3 sources of data. But then if you do that, if you follow that principle, you can trust it much more than 2 or 3 sources, human sources. Human sources are still extremely important because they provide context. They provide an understanding of the motivation. But the discovery of special operation, discovery of the facts of the crime, I would trust data much more than that as a starting point.
Christo, do you still feel threatened?
No, it is an objective risk that prevents me from coming to Russia. There was a time, let me put it this way, I was told that I had a grace period of a year last year because the whole machine was focused on the war, and going after journalists was not a priority. But with the start of the second year of the war, apparently Putin had decided that, okay, time to go back to solving the problem with journalists. And this is not a personal statement on my importance, it's a statement also on all of the Russian journalists that live in exile. And unfortunately, in the last 6 months, we've seen at least 3 attempted poisonings of Russian journalists that are still being investigated by Western society. And this is a sign of the new rules of the game, which are Russia has no reputation cost. It's a much worse situation than in Soviet times, when there was at least some reputation cost concept by the Soviet Union. Now there's no reputation cost, and there's only a game of whack-a-mole where the Kremlin are trying to suppress any voices that can contribute to domestic dissent. And all bets are off. All journalists are at risk at this point, including foreign journalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see this. Marin Lesinski, last question, I suppose.
Marin Lesinski, Open Society Institute. Christo, thank you very much for being with us and for what you're doing. My question is, do you have a recipe how to talk to people who doesn't believe you?
I do not. But you have to measure your interactions. And as I was presented at the beginning of the panel, one of the things that I've given up is to discuss with people who do not engage in a rule-based discussion. And whataboutism is one symbol of that, one symptom of that. And the moment I see that somebody's not prepared to have a structured rule-based conversation, you should bail out of that because you will be wasting your time. If somebody shows a sign that they're willing to engage in a rule-based conversation, such as asking how you know something as opposed to immediately doing an ad hominem attack, then it is worthwhile in engaging, because even if it's not for the benefit of this particular person that you're engaging and spending your time, you are being seen by others as somebody who's willing to engage in a reasonable conversation. So that adds to the credibility. So again, my own recipe is do not waste time with people who are not willing to engage in structured discussion.
Thank you very much, Christo, Grozev, Ivan, Krastev. I would like also to thank Open Society Institute for the chance to moderate this discussion, and to all of you in the audience.